Welcome, comrades, to our latest session in our series Abolition. Tonight we are looking at the question of the police. How could we abolish the police? Why should we abolish the police? And how should we go about it? It's obviously been a lot in the news recently, and not just because of the Black Lives Matter events and uprising, if you wish, but also I think the Sarah Everett murder has shown quite a stark light on what police is like, what the culture is like in the police, the misogyny, the racism within the police, and that's all quite worrying. So it's a very topical subject, and we're very pleased to be joined by Dr. Toyin Agbetu. He's a scholar activist and lecturer in social and political anthropology at the University College London in the Department of Anthropology. Sorry, I left a lot of things out. You have a very long description, but
that's fine.
People will have seen it in the other. Thank you very much for joining us. I explained to him already, I'll explain to the audience quickly. We have about a 30-minute introduction with slides, and people can communicate in the chat, and afterwards, if you have a question or a comment, please click raise hand, and we can bring you in to speak to us and the rest of the audience. So without further ado, thank you for joining us, and I'll retreat.
Okay, well, thank you for the lovely introduction, and greetings, everyone. Nice to have you here with us. I'm going to go through a presentation, but I tend to do these, my presentations tend to be interactive, but this is a webinar, so I can't see you. And you can kind of like see me and engage in the slides and the stuff I'm doing. So I'm going to ask that you bear with me while I just share my screen. All this technical stuff normally is always a recipe for something to go quite amiss. So hopefully in a few seconds you'll see that. Give me 1 second. And hopefully you should be able to see my screen. Are you able to see it? Is that okay?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Excellent. Okay. Now, I use a platform called Mentimeter, and so you can probably see there's a code at the top. So if you've got another browser, you can go to menti.com and type in that code 28709733. Because I'm going to ask a question at the beginning. It's not going to be as interactive as I usually am because this is a different kind of platform. But I do like to kind of like get a quick temperature gauge of where we're at the moment. So as Tina said, my name is Dr. Toyin Agbetu. I'm a scholar activist. I Pan-Africanist and human rights activist. And this topic, I mean, it was a pleasure to be invited to open this topic of abolishing the police. But I thought one thing I should say before I go ahead, just to make things clear to everyone else, and this might be a little bit strange for some of you to grasp on me, is that I am not an abolitionist. I support abolition and I support the movement and I support the theories, but I kind of wanted to say that clear. From an ideological position, it's more the term abolition, just simply because I'm a Pan-Africanist. And for many of you who know that, in Pan-African circles, when we talk about the history of enslavement and we hear the word abolitionist, the name that is thrust upon us most times is that of William Wilberforce. And William Wilberforce, as we know, was not an abolitionist, even though he's been framed as such. And this is why I sometimes struggle with the concept. Doesn't mean I'm not going to talk about abolition of the police, but I just want to get the context right. When we hear about the phrase abolitionists, sometimes we get confused with what I would call incrementalism. What we have this idea about abolition being the eradication of something, when often what people do is use it to slowly move towards a different kind of process. And that's something that I am not in favor of. And so I always start from that position, but I do believe in many aspects of abolition, beyond the police. And this has been an amazing series that's been running over the last few weeks. I'm here to catch all of them, but they are available on YouTube, so I've seen a couple as well. So now I've said that, and and I'll kind of like go in a bit more detail later on. Let me start with a quote that's really important, I think, that applies to every topic to do with abolition. And seeing it is International Women's Month, I call it a month, not just today, I'm going to start with a quote from the famous ancestor, Harriet Tubman. And she makes this amazing quote. She who was in charge of the Underground Railway. I freed 1,000 slaves, but I could have freed 1,000 more if only they knew they were slaves. And this is a really important concept to get when we're talking about abolition. Just simply because often what happens is that when we hear the word, abolish the police, abolish the royalty, we sometimes struggle to think of a different way of the world being. It seems such like a huge concept, a huge idea, that freedom should be something, that is only in dreams. And it's part of the reason why, as a Pan-Africanist, I don't use abolition, I use freedom fighters, but it doesn't mean I don't agree with the idea of abolition. And this is what Harriet Tubman alludes to, this notion that actually a lot of people who actually crave freedom have been tricked into almost and socialized and miseducated in ways they can't conceptualize a world where they are free. And so we currently exist in a state where policing is part of that machinery that keeps that cultural constraint in our head that we cannot abolish it, we cannot be free. And so this is why I want to this is the only time I'm going to ask for interaction, but you're welcome to use Menti to follow the slides afterwards. This is what I'm going to ask. If you've just 30 seconds, really quickly, if you could eradicate any aspect of British policing overnight, what would it be? And if you've got your phones or your laptops or tablets, just quickly put a couple of words in. It's up to you. Any aspect of British policing overnight, what would it be? And I say this, and while I'm, you're thinking about what that word would be, and please, I just need a couple of voices. There's no right or wrong answer. It's not a trick question. It's just a reminder that, a couple of weeks ago, we had, no, I say a couple of weeks ago, a couple of days ago, we have the police forces all across the UK arguing that they're not going to admit to there being institutional racism inside their forces. And this is really outrageous. Ever since the term was coined, first actually by Kwame Ture, you might have known him as Stokely Carmichael from the Black Panthers in 1968, it was kind of like, I would almost say plagiarized later on by Macpherson in the report, but to devastating effect. The whole idea of institutional racism has been played like football, like a game. Like sometimes it exists, sometimes it doesn't, sometimes things are getting better. Either way, the police are just the way it is, and people who moan about this are kind of like do-gooders or woke. All these pejorative terms used, which inverting actually, because woke is a positive term, in inverting them as a way to say that actually the police are just doing the best they can. And, this idea about abolishing them and getting rid of them and defunding them, no, this is nonsense. And so let me quickly, some of the comments that have come up, and thank you those who are making some comments. So if you can eradicate an aspect of British policing, some of you said the patriarchy. I think that's a really good one. And we're going to talk about that later on. Racism, clearly, that's one that I'm very passionate about. That's where my interest in the police lies partly in with my activist work. Violence against citizens. Violence is the key word here. And I think this is the word that we're very squeamish about addressing, that the police are not just institutionally racist, but they're institutionally violent. And it's the violent aspects of that we should be looking to abolish. Acting with impunity, I think we're talking about lack of transparency, the abuse of powers. I would call this straight out corruption. And abolish the police, all of it. Yeah, this is probably the theme of tonight's discussion, and we can go through some of that with a little bit more finesse than I sometimes am known for. But thank you for sharing that. So I'm going to start really with a quick idea. And why are the Popo a problem? Why are the feds a pain in the butt? Why do we want to get rid of them? And you can see I've put down a few examples. There's loads of them. You've already identified them. But yes, they do utilize and abuse a monopoly on force. And that's sometimes a tricky concept to grasp in our minds. We recognize that force exists everywhere. We can push, and I'm not talking about the Star Wars force. We use force, in all realms of life. But there's only, a few agencies in the UK that have legitimately been given or granted powers, apparently, to use force. And so one of them is the police, the other is the military. And when we talk about policing, we tend to think about police in the uniforms and the hat, and we often don't recognize the police as a framework. So it's not just those that we see, the Bobby on the street, for example. It's also those those on the borders, kind of like who are pushing back against immigrants. It's those who are deporting people. It's those in the security, those in prisons, anyone in the criminal justice system. There's a really good phrase I read in that book, abolishing the police, which is what was it? Criminal punishment system. I quite like that one. I've always used criminals justice system because it's a justice system by the criminals, not the other way around. But they utilize and abuse and monopoly and force. And so if you actually push back against them, then they can keep putting in more resources from the state until they overwhelm you with numbers and use force to subdue you and often to kill you. So this is one of the reasons why they're a problem. The second problem, which one of you alluded to on the slide that just passed, was the corruption, the unaccountability. And that corruption, we've got to be clear, exists at all ranks. So often you'll hear the Police Federation and the old Glenn Smythes of the world coming out and saying, why is everyone having to go at the rank and file? We're just doing a hard job. We're doing the stuff that you don't want, that you wouldn't want to do. We're kind of like dealing with the abuse and the druggies and all. It's kind of all these statements they'll make. But what is not acknowledged is that this corruption actually is top down. And so it starts right at the top with the leadership. We don't hear the term police supervisors, but police supervisors actually provide a toxic culture inside the police force itself. So even officers who are trying to be moral are actually punished or in an environment where they can't actually do and say the things that they need to say to reform the system. So that corruption at all ranks is another reason why they're a problem. And then the final reason I would say, and this is someone mentioned the patriarchy, and I completely agree with that, is because the police are established to secure a system of white supremacy. I mean, that's what brought them into existence, right? I mean, in the UK, there's the linking and modeling on the oppression of the Irish. That's where it comes from there. But if we look at the system of policing in the States, then it comes directly from the legacy of what they used to call slave catchers. That's our people who go around in groups to capture enslaved people. This whole idea about the police being this virtuous entity, which is to keep the peace and keep everyone happy. And this is actually not true. It was always premised on a white supremacist agenda. And a white supremacist agenda has many different intersection values. One of them is racism. The other one is misogyny. I don't want to say sexism, it's a straight out misogyny. And even though we had Cressida Dick at the head of the police, and you might think, well, she's a woman, how can a woman be part of or lead a misogynist institution? I'm talking about in London, example. This happens all the time. We have many people who are oppressed who actually are active agents of their own oppression, because remember what I showed with the Harriet Tubman slide, if you don't know that you're oppressed, if you don't know that you are being enslaved, if you haven't decolonized your mind, like Fanon talks about, then actually you are actually part of the problem. And it's not me pointing fingers at everyone. We're all part of that problem. But it's recognizing that white supremacist agenda deals with ethnicity, deals with gender, but it also deals with capital. It is a capitalist system. And so this is what we're going to also expand upon later on. It's really weird. I normally ask the questions as we're talking, but we'll do that all afterwards. I want to keep rabbiting on. I hope you're not getting bored. And if you are, I'm sure EastEnders is on. So, So, how has this come to be? Referring is this lecture discussion or talk, I'm going to give it a UK feel because that's where I'm based. It's because we're socialized to believe the police are this lovely, bumbling, kind of like cheerful, Bobby on the street kind of force. In fact, we're not even supposed to use the word police force anymore. I don't know if you remember, that's shifted to police service because they serve us, right? They're no longer a force. And whenever there is trouble, we're told it's just the one bad apple. Now, by now, I mean, most of you have seen the level of corruption that's been exposed in the police. And I'm not going to go through a catalogue of the sexist abuse, the racist abuse. I mean, you can read this. That's not my job here. My job is just to open up this discussion so we can have an honest and informed discussion around the topic. But the whole point is that people like PC Plum here on Balamory, which, you know, my children were, I feel guilty now, subjected to when they were growing up. Some of you had probably watched Burnside on the Bill, or, you know, The Sweeney with Regan, right? And all those kind of programs. I grew up in the era of Starsky and Hutch. In fact, every Sunday, I still watch Columbo. I love detective programs. I'm a nerd. Columbo is my favorite all time, yeah? So I grew up actually wanting to be a police officer. This is one of the contradictions here, right? I thought I'm a nerd. I love detail. I love attention to detail. I love Columbo. It's like, you know, I want to catch the bad people. But somehow, after I was tasered and arrested and flung in cells, and the police kept on addressing me and my friends and my family, as a teenager, this is before I became an adult, as a teenager, I came to the conclusion that the bad people were the police. And that created a seismic shift in my approach to life and how I started thinking. Now, of course, I know not every police officer are bad apples, you know, and I hope I don't have to keep caveating everything I'm saying. But I'm just talking about that. I'm in my 50s and teenage Toyin was abused by the police officers. Some of you are old enough to remember SPG vans, where you're just walking down the street, the vans would come around, they'd see you and they'd jump out the vans and then they'd start using the N-word and all these kind of things. I went through that. My sons and their friends are exposed to this. So it's more than this simple bad apples theory. It's rotten to the core. And I'm using British police as an example. I can talk about this in other countries. I could talk about, obviously, the Americas, talk about this across Europe. I can talk about it in Nigeria. I've experienced bad situations in Nigeria. But today, we're focusing on the UK. There's something rotten with policing. Let's go to the next slide. So what's the mantra that we're always told? How did we get here? Like I said, well, we're socialized to believe that the police are here to protect and serve. This is the message that we're given, right? We're no longer a police force, they're a police service, they protect us and they serve us. So why is Alexander Boris de Piffle Johnson using the police as a prop? Well, the reason he's using that is because they're also a political entity. They're a political entity that maintain the economic order. And this is what the Prime Minister, I don't like to call him Boris, his name is Boris Alexander de Piffle Johnson. You know, he uses them as a prop to maintain the system as they want it. I don't need to go through all the corruption that's taken place during COVID. I'm sure you can do that independent research yourself. He also uses the police, however, to force us to obey the political order. And that's really the nub here. That what happens is that there's a small elite. They often refer to the metropolitan elite, you know, these clowns here in Parliament, when in reality, they're the ones who are passing laws. They're the ones who are writing the law. We saw with Partygate, they don't actually follow their own laws and legislations that they make, but they use the police force to enforce those laws, to obey and to give deference to their order. And this is really key. I wish we had time to examine some of the teachings of Gramsci, but I don't need to. We're talking about the police. And so the police are following and obeying the political order and reproducing it on the streets. But what we also have to acknowledge is that they enforce territorial borders. And when I say that, I'm not just talking about internal borders, and inside that, I'm talking about racialized spatial context where, you know, if you are from one particular group and you're in the wrong area. So if I was walking down Kensington, Chelsea one day and jogging in a tracksuit top or, you know, tracksuit or something, then what happened is that there's likely I'd be stopped. Or, you know, if a young person is, I don't want to make these hypotheticals. These are real situations. So they enforce these borders internally. If you drive out of London, and then police will use A&R, you know, this is a car recognition software. They'd see your number plate, see it wasn't registered in that area, and they'd stop you and have an inquired question: what are you doing over here? If you are not of the economic order or the political order. They also enforce territorial borders, and we're seeing this right now with the conflict in Ukraine. You're seeing the idea of how all these restrictions, which they're quickly trying to back off, which were put in place on racialized criteria. And so we mustn't think of the police. I'm using the images of domestic policing, but we must never limit our scope when we hear the word police or abolishing the police as to just be PC plod. It's far wider than that. The concept of abolishing the police is abolishing policing, and abolishing, to be quite specific, harmful, violent policing. And violence is not just physical violence. Let me move on. If you've got any questions, please remember them and write them down for the chat and take notes and all that stuff. I'm happy to get into a fisticuff if you're over anything you disagree with. That's my style. So as well as protect and serve, there's this nonsense about law and order. We are a party of law and order, and we're going to put more bobbies in the street. We're going to get 20,000 more police officers, and we're friendly though. Well, this is the British police that you're looking at. Now, people will say, well, hold on, we don't have armed police walking around in the UK. Well, actually, we do have armed response units that respond to what they say are terrorist threats. But the problem is that that's not the only time that they're actually engaged. If you live in Tottenham, and you would have heard of what happened in where an elder was pushed down the stairs when the police kind of like charged into his house thinking that they were chasing after a subject, a suspect who wasn't there. You would hear about the history of Cherry Gross. There's so many stories about the police using force disproportionately, ending up with the deaths of innocent people. So, this idea about the police being law and order and being non-violent is something we need to challenge. And I'll give you examples of why I say that. The first is that we're always being told that, we live in a free society. But the presence of a police force that is using violence to kind of like keep maintaining the public order has this effect of oppressing our agency. People recognize that something is wrong. They feel that they should feel safe with the police around, but they don't feel safe. It's like if I call the police, I don't feel safe. Like people who suffering from family members who've got mental health issues. So say someone in your family had a crisis, you should feel that you could be able to call for help. But if you call for help from the police, there's a very good chance that your family member could end up dead. So what happens is that our agency, our freedoms are curtailed because we don't trust that the police are agents of law and order. And we have evidence to back that. Again, I can do the caveat, it's not every police officer, it's not every instance, blah, 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 blah. But the relative situation, as a collective body, this is the outcomes. It's the same thing like with COVID, whether you believe it or not, whatever. It's like, it's only 1% that is likely to have a fatal outcome. But when you live on an island of 70 million people, that 1% is pretty significant. And everyone doesn't think it's going to be them, but it's going to be someone and it could be you. And so it's the same thing with the policing. Everyone has a policing outcome. It might just be dealing with fines. It might be dealing with a little bit of rowdiness outside a pub. But one day you could be on your way home and be misidentified like Charles de Mendes and end up dead. It's always someone else until it's you. So all this plays on what we think we can do about our agency. The police also criminalize citizens. And I say that, and I know that might sound very provocative, because you think, no, the police catch criminals, right? That's what they do. That's what we see in all the programs. They go around with a siren and they catch the bad people. Well, no. Again, it's the same thing with language. This whole idea from a police force to a police service, what people, also, I'm a nerd, so I monitor language. I'm an anthropologist. Culture, language matters. We moved around 10 years ago from a language of investigation and information to intelligence. And so what used to happen, police used to gather information, do an investigation, and then do an arrest for criminals. Somehow that shifted, and now we say, well, we've had intelligence, and from that intelligence, we're going to make an arrest. And you see what happens when you use words like that? It means that rather than hearing the word information, you hear the word intelligence. You assume that the information they're acting on has some kind of rational process put towards it, that there has been some kind of investigation, there has been some logic. It's not biased, it's not racist, it's not class-based, there's no other issues. No, that's not what's always happening now. The investigative capacities of the police have been so curtailed that actually what's happening is that you're getting a lowering and a lowering of the bars, and you're finding people who are joining the police, and I'm sorry to say this, some people might be upset by this, who actually shouldn't be anywhere near having that level of authority over their fellow public members. They just shouldn't have guns. They shouldn't, they're just not equipped mentally, socially, spiritually, morally to be police officers. But the recruitment drive is what's happening. And so these people who have got these biases, because the recruitment process in the current police force is what's corrupt, the recruitment drive is so poor that what's happening is that police officers are criminalizing innocent people. And you know, you might think, well, there was that saying, if you haven't done the crime, you haven't got nothing to be fearful, you've got nothing to be scared of, all this kind of stuff that people say. Well, I remember back in the days, and it's my age showing again, when VHS machines came out. And VHS machines, for those who don't know, you know, was a videotape format, and you could put a thing inside a machine, you watch a TV program, you can record it and then play it again, and watch it when you want and give it to your friends. It was actually illegal to tape programs on TV. It's the same thing like cassette tapes. You could listen to the radio, put cassette tape and record music. And people used to make, I used to make tapes of all your favorite records, things that you bought. It was illegal. But what happened, people did it anyway. And so the police chose not to intervene with that, because they would have to arrest half the nation. And so we sometimes confuse the issue of what's legal and what's moral. And often what's happened is that things that are legal are actually immoral, and things that are moral are made illegal. And so this whole idea that there is one body called the police, which is given legislation from one body called the executive, that's the body that runs government, actually can then determine what is right and what's wrong, what's legal, and the police enforce that. There's a fallacy. And this is why we have miscarriages of judgment. And we often have miscarriages of judgment. It's why we have processes like judicial review, so we can actually overturn. And now we're having a parliament that's actually saying it's going to curtail the powers of judge to do judicial review. So this is all linked to policing, believe it or not. I'm a nerd. I told you I'm a nerd. I'm going to go into detail. The last thing they do, as a scholar activist, I would say this, and they do lots of other things, but just in the context of law and order, they stifle dissent. You know, and it's right now it's the most patronizing time ever, right? You know, you're hearing politicians talking about how, you know, in Russia, you wouldn't see the situation taking place in the UK, the protests, blah, 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 blah. And you know, the police, and what's it, police and criminal bill is coming out. I've forgotten what they called it. They called a bill a legislation, and that actually allows the Home Secretary to place curtailments on how much protest we can do, whether we can disrupt, how loud we can be. In fact, I remember when Extinction Rebellion were organizing protests, before they actually went on the protests, they were building up some lovely banners and making some structures and stuff like that. The police raided them and arrested them before they actually went on the protests. So we're literally watching. We haven't talked about this, but they were doing what I would call pre-crimes. If those of you who've seen that Tom Cruise film, Minority Reports, that was a pre-crime. They hadn't committed the crime, but they were arrested. The material was destroyed, and they were charged before they committed the crime. And we as a people should be outraged that this is happening. Not, no, we're distracted and we're thinking about something else. You know, so this is what I mean by stifling dissent. So if that wasn't bad enough to complicate things, we're also in the midst, and I love technology, but we're also in the midst of what I would call digital warfare. I'm going to whiz through this because I know I'm probably going over time and I don't want to do that. Digital warfare. So, oops, I've gone back. Let me go back. There we go. Digital warfare means we have curtailments on our privacy. So we're living in what I'd call surveillance society. And you've probably heard the term CCTVs everywhere. I'm not sure if you're aware of the Ring scandal, where Amazon have this thing called Ring. You could buy it, it's a doorbell, you hit the doorbell, it shows your face, and then you can open up people. Great innovation, right? It's like you could be upstairs on your sofa, someone rings your bell, you hit the button, you can see who it is. Perfect. And then what happened was that the police started to contact Amazon and say, look, we want the footage so we can see who's been around the area so we can do an investigation. And you might think it's a civic thing to do, but actually what happened then, it means that all of a sudden, everybody was implicated in the police operation, sharing data that was actually, you could say it's in the public realm, but it's private information and giving it to the police. So this is just one way surveillance society has started to encroach on our liberties. There's many, many examples about the breach of privacy. Ethnicity, the matrix database. I think I spoke about Tottenham. Stafford Scott did some amazing work. He's an activist there. If you haven't heard about him, you really do need to read about his work, and hopefully you saw the exhibition at ICA. The matrix database is where the police gather the names of people who they suspect are involved in crime, and I'm talking about crime which affects the African heritage community. They also, on that same database, keep people who have been hurt as a result of that. They keep the details of siblings who have people who might be involved in that or who might have been hurt in that. So all of a sudden what's happening is that people who have not been engaged in any form of crime are now on a police database and are now potential suspects. They are intelligence. Like, remember what I said about information and intelligence? They are intelligence. And so when the police want to do a roundup because the politicians are telling them, you need to do something to deal with youth violence, they go onto their database, and what they do is that they go through the list and they start rounding them up. Now, there has been some pushback. You know, they've had to prune the list, and there are now more controls, but again, the controls are in the hand of the police. So what's happening is that the digital warfare is also got a racializing element. I could talk about how that intersects with the privacy issue when we talk about CCTV cameras that misidentify people based on their skin color, but that's a whole nother discussion. Digital warfare, this one was really irritating. This one, there's two databases. I'm going to be really quick. The Domestic Extreme Database and the National Police Order Intelligence Unit, which maintains its own database. And this basically is, if you are involved in what they call domestic extremism, and I'm not talking about what they would term far-right extremism, like neo-Nazis. I'm talking about if you are an animal rights protester. So I'm pretty much a vegan. I'm a vegetarian, but I'm kind of like 99% vegan. So I would fall onto potentially the domestic extremist database if I engage in any kind of activity which kind of like was trying to stop experiments on animals. They would keep the database, they'd photograph me, you're logged as a potential threat to society. This is about people who are conscientious people, who want to do good things in their society, who want to make the world a better place, who are being pre-criminalized. I just made up a new word there. Yeah, pre-criminalized. They're going on this database. And essentially what happens is that when the investigations start, they are the first funnel that the police look through. It's not Columbo-style detective work. This is just lazy. I won't even call it detective work. This is lazy investigations. So this is the digital warfare issue. And then the last thing I want to talk about, this one, is dehumanization. This is the collecting of biometric data, and it's almost like a half extent. So you've probably seen it in schools where children go to schools, they have to use their fingerprints to get for their lunch. This argument for this was about, it was not about bullying. It was very much about, the arguments about, you know, to stop bullying, people have to carry money. But what happens to that database afterwards? What happens to that data afterwards? And we are now carrying and being asked to give more and more of our biometric information. And this is very problematic. It doesn't just happen at schools, it happens in borders. You might have heard the announcement from the government that, okay, so they're going to start opening up the borders, going to start catching the biometric data. It's on the passports. All of this stuff, again, is digital warfare, which is part of the policing matrix, the policing industrial complex. That's what it is. I want to give you a really quick video to watch. It's not that long, really, really fast. Hopefully it'll play. It's very cute, right? Boston Dynamics, amazing technology. You see the dog there? Look at those moves. Amazing. So it's going to be used for search and rescue jobs. This is going to be used for moving boxes around warehouses. All precariousness, all low-paid jobs being destroyed by technology. They can dance, yeah? Amazing. I'm going to stop that there. I know it's only 21 seconds, but you get the gist, okay? Okay, so that's what's happening. That's now. That's not in the future. That we have this technology now. People are spending money on it now. Last year, what do us lovely humans love to do when we have that kind of technology? Well, you see the dog there? There's an exhibition now. You can buy a spot with a gun on the top of it. It is a paintball gun on the top of it for 50 grand. Yeah, this is the danger. So we often think we can offload. Okay, so we say that policing is the humans that are the error, they're the problem in this, and abolishing the police is go too far. Let's make algorithms, let's use technology to actually eradicate the bias, so there's no racism, there's no misogyny. We'll do AI police. No, we cannot do that. Okay, I don't even want to start along the line about military drones. We cannot do that. We need to abolish policing, and I'm talking about violent policing. We cannot offset the problem. So I've given you a lot of negatives. I'm going to try and move forward to some examples of what we should be doing. And again, I'm a nerd, concepts. So I'm going to talk about peace studies. This is something. In a shot, there's an amazing academic, Johan Galtang. He talks about peace studies. He explains violence occurs in 3 different forms. The first is episodic, and we're used to episodic violence. That's when it happens now on the street, in our face. You know, the harm is dramatic, it happens, it's intense, we get used to it, and we think that it's a one-off. Then there's structural violence. That's a type I deal with. This is a time where harm is normalized. It's slow, it's indirect, it's in the systems that we live with. It's normalized. We don't even see it coming. It's the things that make us enslaved because we don't recognize that we're building in, we are contributors to that structural violence. And then as an anthropologist, it's the cultural violence systems that I deal with, that I'm the most really scared of. These are ones where we have symbolic processes that legitimize those social injustices. And those injustices are the ones that lead to these inequitable systems that are both political, that are economic, and they are also spiritual, and they harm us. And so that means it's the songs, it's the dancing robots, all those kind of ideas, those things normalize it, they maintain it, they prevent us from actually really seeing the problem and dealing with the structural violence. So weird not having you talking back to me. You best talk back to me after this. So near the close, Black Lives Matter program for police abolition. I've really summed it up. Really summed it up. I know some of you thought I was just going to talk about defunding the police and talking about disarming the police and disbanding the police. And we can talk about that if you ask questions. Defunding the police, great initiative, taking the money away from police budgets. It's happened in America, in certain states. They shift the money from the police, they move it into social community projects that actually help deal with inequality, that help deal with impoverishment. There's pushback, there's always going to be pushback. That's the process. Defunding is a gradual process. It's the right one. Disarming the police is a harder sell to do, and disbanding the police is the ultimate aim. But this is the program that we talk about when people talk about police abolition. And there's some amazing abolitionists doing that work. But I think that we have to recognize that it's not a one-hit wonder. You take aim at one of the strands and you just work it, and you work in partnership with others. Whizzing through, rethinking abolition. This is me now talking. One of my favorite movements of all time, community movements of the Black Panther Party. Most people know that, who know me. And that I have a vision for society. And I say that, okay, this is what we need to do in Toyin's nerdy terms. We need to support countercultural discourses. And this is a hard one for many people, because actually what happens is that we kind of like get into this group think when we, even in my own activist groups, because we know we think that we're trying to create a better world, and I'm kind of anarchist leading and those kind of things, we kind of like to forget that actually there are people out there who have completely opposing views to us. And we kind of need to not try to eliminate it, but to understand it, even if we keep it to one side and we disagree with it. Because those countercultural discourses are sometimes our discourses. And so we do not want to live in a world where we only hear one voice. That's what happened, and that's where we are right now, where we had the Trumpian type rhetoric going around. This is the kind of thing that led to the existing government that we have in power right now. It was the suppression of countercultural discourses. And that is just, when I say discourse, I'm talking about discussions, opinions, views, ideologies. We need to have that diversity of different kind of ideas, and we have to support that. We have to, that enriches us. It doesn't weaken us, it enriches us. We also, if we talk about other things to do, and this is, I think, this is probably what some people would call abolition, the police, I would say criminalize structural violence. So we have to get to a position where we recognize what structural violence is. And that's where, as an anthropologist, that's the kind of work that I want to do. We spend a long time in it, particularly in the community. We see where the structural violence is. We see how it's impacting on the lives of communities, and we identify the structural violence, and then we criminalize it. We have to turn that into the boot. We don't just say, well, you know, it's just the way things are. That's the process. That's the society that I want to live in, that I think we should be working to. The next thing is that we make all institutions for the people accountable to the people. Parliament is not accountable to us. The police are not accountable to us. The banks are not accountable to us. The monarchy is not accountable. Every institution that claims to be for us are not of us, all of them. And so even though we can join, we have to jump through hoops and hurdles, you know, we have to join, you know, kind of like, you know, these orders and kind of like accept, kneel before the monarch and all the kinds of rituals that we have to do to prove that we're not going to, you know, kind of like go crazy and destroy the system afterwards. These are problematic. And so I say that we have to make all institutions that claim to be for the people accountable to the people. That's a lot of work. I'm not going to lie about that. And then finally, this is the most radical of all, and this is slightly, I'll admit, going away from the topic of abolishing the police, but I believe that if we understand what abolition of the police is, which is ultimately abolishing the conditions that require the police, let me say that again, abolishing the police means abolishing the conditions that require the police so that we recreate a system where we then actually remove harm, so police are actually doing positive work. To do that, we need to create a society where we do things like decommodify food, we decommodify medicine, we decommodify housing. That does mean, yeah, no rent. It does mean, yeah, free medicine. It does mean, yeah, free food. How does that happen? How can we live in a world where, well, what did we happen during lockdown? It's doable, it's possible. We choose not to do it. We allow an elite to not do it. And then we revert, and that's what's happening, reverting back to a system where the police then have to protect or choose to protect people with power and their property. So in summary, I think he's going to say, the questions I want us to think about, how do we delegitimize punitive norms? And we do live in a world where we think that revenge is normal, that if a child is naughty, we exclude them. We think everything's punitive. We live in a disciplinary society and system, and we don't understand that actually, if you just create more harm when harm comes, then you end up in a vicious circle. We have to prioritize care. We have to be compassionate. We have to think about healing. We have to solve them. We have to think in a reparative manner if we want to get rid of punitive norms. And that's why I said a cultural violence is the most dangerous of all. That's one question. The next question is, how do we manifest instead of sloganize ideas like people before profit? Because when I say people before profit, I mean it. But sometimes it's used so much that it becomes meaningless. And, you know, the worst case scenario, you know, that was what happened with Grenfell. I might say the worst case scenario, there's often many other examples. But we saw what happened with Grenfell. It triggered something in people's minds. They kind of got it. And then what's happened as the years and the inquiry is just another policing tactic. It's part of the criminal justice system. It delays justice to the point where you forget about justice. And then what happens is that rather than talking about the loss of lives, you're talking about the cladding scandal. Well, I'm not saying the cladding scandal is not important, but the most important issue is that people died, 72 plus people died on the altar of profit. So we have to find a way to manifest these ideas as opposed to sloganize these ideas. And abolition is a great sloganizing technology. It really, all the complex stuff I'm saying is really simple to say, abolish it. But the truth of the matter is we have to do both. We use the sloganization to bring people in, and we use education to manifest it by being discreet in how we deal with it. And then I think this is the last slide. I've got a terrible memory. Is how do we build stateless peacemaking institutions? And I would argue that this is the point of education. Many of us know something has to happen. And I say peacemaking and not peacekeeping. The Black Panther Party movement was actually a peacekeeping movement, but I say we had to actively make peace. We had the United Nations all during this conflict that's taking place. I've not heard nothing substantial about peacekeeping roles. We need to be peacemaking. I grew up watching Thunderbirds, and you know, and I had this idea that if you're in trouble, you just called International Rescue. I'm stuck, help me. And there was this organization that I built my organization on that model that would hear you and came to help because they were peacemaking. They were solving those issues. And I think we can do that. We have the resources to do it. We have the intelligence. We have everything. What we don't have is sufficient will. We haven't broken the fear. We've been so socialized that if we get rid of the police, if we get rid of prisons, if we get rid of all these totalizing institutions that actually cause us trauma, that we will lose our privileges, we will lose our security. It will be chaos. And we hear the word anarchy as if it's a bad thing, as if the world didn't live without states, without nation states. Nation states magnify these problems. The borders cause the problems. So how do we build stateless peacemaking institutions? It has to be an institution, by the way, because if it's just one person, it's just a charismatic person, then all that happens when that person burns out or passes away or is assassinated is that the movement has to start all over again. So we have to understand that process. I can't remember what this next slide is, so I'm pretty sure I'm finished. There we go. It's the great old Frederick Douglass. I thought I started with an abolitionist and a freedom fighter with Harriet Tubman. I thought I'd end with one. He is often called an abolitionist. That's probably because he was also politically conservative. You know, not everyone's perfect, but he was an amazing freedom fighter. And his quote was about another abolitionist, the amazing John Brown. And he says, every hour saw the evil spreading and deepening. Church, state, politics, and religion were defiled and dying as by this moral pestilence. The nation was sinking into a sleep of moral death and needed some such thunderclap as John Brown's raid to wake it up. Now, John Brown's raid was during the time of enslavement, and this is where someone who wasn't directly implicated or affected by the history of enslavement, he was someone who was racialized as white, he was a European American, actually intervened in the act of abolishing slavery. He was murdered afterwards by the state. You know, he was demonized. They said he had mental health issues. They did same thing they did with Corbyn. They did every single trick to say there was something wrong with him. But the truth of the matter is what he did was that he acted. And I'm not saying that we should all go around doing John Browns, but we need to have that level of conviction. If we can't actually intervene in those kind of ways, and I'm not saying everyone should, in that time I think it was relevant, I'm saying that we need to actually do something. I think, my memory serves me correctly, that's the last slide. And I'll close with the wonderful Muna Abdi, who says, instead of praising people for being resilient, change the systems that are making them vulnerable. So that's my take on abolishing the police. I thought I'd do it a little bit different. You've heard all the stats about stop and search, and you know, Google's just over there.
Absolutely brilliant. I really enjoyed that. Thank you so much. I think that was a very excellent and entertaining contribution. I can just see you as a thunderbird going around rescuing the world. We've had one person so far who wants to come in. I'm sure that other people will raise their hand. If it's okay, I do have a couple of questions for you and comments, so I'm going to make a start. I think you quite rightly put hit the nail on the head when you said the police is there not to protect us from, bad and evil. Although, I have a young child and she still thinks that, she thinks the police are there when something happens, something bad happens, you call the police and they help you. And I'm sure on occasion they do that as well. But the crucial thing is, as you said, they're there to maintain the political power, to keep those who are in charge, keep them in charge and do everything to defend them and their property. Anybody who's been around the miners' strike, for example, will know very well what side the police are on. Or a demonstration where you get kettled, etc. They don't, they do what they're told, or worse. And sometimes when they do worse. And of course, we're living in a period which you did mention the crime and policing bill, and there are other bills which are currently going through. And I think the left is not paying quite enough attention to that, or just focusing on one, the nationalities and borders bill, there's the crime bill. These is a package that is designed to, use the COVID stuff that's still been going on to really crush our forces and to keep us down should we ever become an organized class again. I mean, as a socialist, I would say it's a class issue. So there's I thought I'd quickly share something I've seen in the newspapers today, which I found quite scary. So this is Facebook has been monitoring the messages of a guy, a DJ. He's a pedophile. I'm not defending pedophiles, etc. But they basically have been monitoring. They must have been monitoring all sorts of people, and they've basically reported him to the police because they became suspicious, etc. Now, I put this on my Facebook, and I got a lot of people saying, well, what are you defending pedophiles? Are you saying we shouldn't, that's a bad thing? Of course, I'm not defending pedophiles. But if you think they're only monitoring, the really bad guys and the pedophiles, and who's making these judgments? What is the kind of crime we should be following? BDS movement is now being outlawed, the pro-Palestine movement. Socialists have been outlawed in the past, Black Lives Matter, etc., etc. They're being banned in schools. You're not allowed to talk about this anymore. So if you think that they're only coming for the bad guys, you got another thing coming. So this is a serious period we're actually living through. We're not very strong at the moment, but I think capitalism is at a really weak point, at a vulnerable point. It's going down the pan. There isn't yet an alternative yet. The working class isn't very strong. But I think that really the ruling class are making preparations to avoid us becoming a really strong class again. And we should be very aware what's going on there. I was just in a meeting the other day where the Prevent program that you touched upon, which is also very much part of this, a boy in a school was talking about a terraced house. And the teacher understood a terrorist house. Oh. And I think he's 5 or 6 years old. Prevent was called. His parents had to go, got a lot of grief, are on a register now, etc., etc. This is all stuff. Or a boy calling, for Free Palestine outside school, and he's got Prevent called on him. These are all attacks happening on us that are really very, very worrying. And I know you didn't mention the word socialism, but I think your idea of a different society sounds very much like my idea of socialism. So if we can't just say, oh, we abolish the police tomorrow. That would be absolute chaos, no doubt. But in the transition to a society that works very well. Just imagine if we delegitimize, if we legitimize drug use or decriminalize drug use, how much crime would fall? How much less police you would need, etc. And the structural violence of capitalism I think requires a lot of policing, etc. I mean, a lot of people find it difficult to imagine a society where you don't need, 10,000 more police every month, etc., etc. But actually a society where people kind of look after each other, sort each other out when there is an issue, and have a collective approach to, people doing rubbish. I mean, there will be people, we've discussed it the other day with Camilla Power, when in a more primitive way that people live together. When somebody is getting out of line or wanting more than the others band up on him and say, stop doing that. What are you doing? Stop it. And, the power of collectivity in, trying to stop people behaving in an antisocial manner is, I think, something that you alluded to. So, I mean, some people with, when they're talking about to defund the police or replace it, etc., and they have some kind of idea about a community police, or do you have any kind of, sort of a stage or something where you think they're how it could be replaced with, or do you see it more like it actually needs the change of society to do away with the need for policing?
I don't think these things are either or. I think that they happen simultaneously. I think that's the only way that you actually you land on something that works. When I think about the Black Panther movement, for example, when they were defending the community, the African Americans, by going around with the berets and patrolling with their rifles and stuff, and so basically Euro-America was kind of like being petrified by them because they were thinking, oh my God, what's going to happen? That wasn't the trigger point that turned them into enemy number one. What became the problem was when they started running the breakfast clubs, when they started feeding children at schools and actually doing the social work, actually becoming that socialist type Pan-Africanist organization that they were always meant to be. And then they started to attract a wider base. And I think that's how we have to see when we talk about things like policing. You can't talk about defunding the policing as a great political strategy, because we know we live in a capitalist city environment, and we know that essentially anything that threatens economic resources will get a response. It will actually, it's like a punitive way to get change. But that's not the holistic way to get change. The holistic way to get change is actually to start the community policing. It's to start solving some of those issues without the police. It's to start not calling them unless it's something you have to use them. And that's scary, right? Because people fear, their privilege, their loss of their life, their security. And so they know that the police have infinite resources. But what would you do if you were part of a network of 1,000 people in London that all signed up to saying that if anyone's in trouble, we will get to that place in time? And we've been trained, we've been disciplined, we'll follow a protocol, we're accountable, and we will resolve this issue, and we will always seek the non-violent approach first. But what I think people will do is they'll say, actually, if this is a real organization, this is a real community initiative, I'll give that a shot, because I've got someone who's actually on the periphery of crime, and and they want to get out, but they don't know how to get out. They don't feel protected by the police, and they now have an option. I think that's what's important, is that we sometimes, rather than talking about doing these things, we just need to start doing it. And even if you do it with a small pilot project and then build it from that, so you learn from the mistakes, that's how it works. Because we do see it work through urban social movements. We see it happen when spontaneously. This is what happened with George Floyd. We see citizen journalism. We see so what the Black Lives Matter movement was. We see those kind of collectives happen when we are outraged at the audacious nature of the state, when it shot Mark Duggan, when it murdered, God, I'm trying to think of my boy with the Skittles, my brain, Trayvon Martin. When we saw it murder George Floyd, what happens is that there's something guttural that says we have to organize. And then we create a hostile environment that the state itself will actually throw officers on the sword. They don't often do that, but they will do that, occasionally. So I think, in answer to your question, Tina, it's like, I think it's not enough to call for something to happen. That's part of the strategy. That's a propaganda side, which galvanizes and gets more people to join. The solution is actually to start doing it, and to start creating that community, to start being that change you want to see. And that's a very difficult piece of work to do. I'm not going to even pretend it's easy. But once you know history, once you know that societies have lived like that, then you understand that we can still live like that.
I agree. It was a rhetorical question, but I like your answer. Okay, Zbigniew, you need to switch your camera on, please. In the meantime, I'm taking Steve Freeman. Oops. Hi, Steve.
Hi, Tina, and thanks, Toyin. That was a really excellent talk, and I agree with your basic thesis. I want to try and not add to it exactly, but just bring something, I hope, to it, because I agree with I think there's two things that we could sharpen up. One is that, and I would contrast a communist view and a Republican view of the problem. So if a communist, they believe one day that we can abolish the state, we can abolish borders, and therefore we can abolish the police. We can abolish the police if we've still got a state, because the police and the state sort of go together. Whereas Republicans think that you can have a different kind of police, which is the bit you were saying before. In other words, the characteristic of the police is the separation of in our society is the separation of police from citizens. And so you can see in your example of Black Panthers, how that in an American culture, the idea that citizens should start taking up the policing functions is exactly what, in a way, from what you said, the Black Panthers doing it. And they didn't just limit it to police, what you might call police functioning. The danger was when they started to widen it out into a social function. Now, of course, you can be a Republican communist who believes that in order to get to the place when you can abolish all these things, you need to go through that Republican direction, first of all, in dealing with the actual police we've got. I mean, it could be we scrap the police and create another kind of police or a different kind of police. You know, that's not abolishing it. It's just transforming it in a kind of, which, as you said before, into a kind of democratic sort of police. So I was thinking that what people don't sometimes think is that the police in this country, they're an extension of Crown power. Now, that Crown power is the bureaucracy, it's the police, it's the Secret Service, and it's the military. They're the power over the citizens. So when you meet, you don't meet the Queen. No one meets the Queen, but you do meet the Crown when you meet a policeman in the street, because you meet in the power of the state, and the power of the state is the power of the Crown, and it's the Crown, not the Queen, that's really the problem we have to deal with. And you can meet the Crown when you meet an individual policeman, or you can go somewhere and 100 of those people are standing there. They've gathered there to control your picket line or your protest, or take some quite clear political action over pickets. So in a sense, the police are part of society. And if we live in a racist society, we live in a sexist society, and all the other things we can say, then we're going to get that kind of police as well, by the way, because in a certain sense, you can't really change the police independently of changing the society and changing the state. They're not just changing the society in the way that the Black Panthers were doing in terms of feeding people, but also changing the state. So I think the key thing that I heard in you say, in a way, is the idea of having a democratic state, so that making law and enforcing law becomes not just a specialist privilege for some people. It actually starts to merge with the citizens, so that the distinction between police, state, and citizens starts to disappear. And you don't have to wait for that to happen, as you say, that citizens can start doing, and citizens do start policing themselves in some circumstances because they're forced to do so. You know, if there's an attack on the streets, people will get together and patrol the streets and do things like that. So I think that's the idea. We want to create a democratic state, and then we'll have a democratic police. And if it's based on values of equality and solidarity, then the kind of police we'll get won't be a separate group, but we ourselves will be doing more policing functions. We may need some specialist skills that we all don't have. So we wouldn't necessarily, forensic scientists, I wouldn't be able to do that, and the average citizen couldn't do that. So we'll still need all certain types of things, but a lot of the things that are done could be done by organising citizens. And the Black Panthers, I think, was an example of people in an American culture trying to do exactly that. They're only doing what the American Republic said they could do, and that frightened the hell out of them. So they did, out of the establishment, they didn't really like it at all. What they did was American. It was Republican in a way, and that was terrible, because it was Black people with bearing arms and Black people doing all these things, and that was absolutely terrible as far as they were concerned. So I think that's what we've got to do: a police which comes from the people, by the people, and for the people. And of course, as Tina said, if we change the laws and various other things in that transformation, then police will be wanting to do a different thing. They should spend more time in the City of London investigating what the hell's going on there, with where all the money's being stolen from, instead of coming around here. We look after ourselves. You get over there and arrest some big criminals over there. That's what I think. So I think that's all I'd say. So I'm agreeing with you, really. I just wanted to sort of try to sharpen up that idea that we do need a police, but a different kind of police. Eventually, one day the whole lot will go, and we won't have any police or states or borders, I believe.
Thank you. I mean, that's the long plan. I mean, I am opposed to borders, but we live in a world where borders are erected, where the concepts of human rights exist, and they're not universal. Where, like you said, I don't want to reiterate what you said. A lot of you said. I agree with what you're saying there. I think for me, the biggest work I would say as an educator is to do that work of giving people the concepts of not just talking it, but actually showing it in action and working, so they get that. And you're right, we do it all the time in kind of like macro isolation. We kind of create the service that we need, and I think what's happened is that the power of I'm trying to not get all nerdy, but hegemony has got this really amazing way of reaffirming these ideas, which we then sign up to, and we think that there is no other way of things being. And so the monarchy, it seems like it's always going to be there. Well, its power is waning. I mean, perfect example, we bow down to it when we take these trinkets. And I have a philosophy that, someone who's dishonorable cannot bestow honors. So if the monarchy is a dishonorable institution, how can it bestow honors? But if the people themselves are accept them and recognize them as honors, even when it passes on these dishonorable ideas to people who don't deserve it, then we keep reaffirming and validating a corrupt system. And so while the arguments that you're saying are 100% on point, I think that there's a failure, and I have to own that as an educator, in that we haven't communicated those ideas properly enough. And it's probably why I love sci-fi. Even what's her name? Oh God, I've forgotten her name. Ursula Le Guin. She in The Dispossessed, when she renders an amazing anarchist world, and and it starts to paint a picture of what things could be. But unless we have more songs and poems, and it sounds very wishy-washy, but unless we do have more songs and poems and art and films that actually conceptualize this world with no borders, with a police that is like, oh, today I'm taking the policing duty of this particular area, and then I'm going back to my carpentry tomorrow. And until we start to see that working and visualize it working, we tend to fall back to the default because we want security. And it's one of the things that, as humans, we kind of crave. And I get it. It's an existential question, isn't it? We want to exist. We want to persist. And it's far better the devil we know. I think that's the phrase. I don't particularly agree with that. Far better the devil we know than the devil we don't. So no, amazing points there. And, thank you for sharing.
I agree with that point. The Queen is a symbol of the whole corruption of the whole system. So, that's the focal point for a lot of it, although it's the crown that's the power and it's the Queen that's the symbol.
I felt I scared my students when I told them that, like Elizabeth Gotha Goldberg could actually come into a lecture hall, pull out a gun and massacre everyone. And she could not be prosecuted in the courts because the courts, they've created a system where the courts cannot prosecute the head of state. And because the court is her, she can't prosecute herself, which means we are not living in a meritocracy. We are not living in a democracy. These are, and these concepts, it's like people just don't understand. Well, I don't want to sound patronizing. A lot of people are unaware of. And it's our job to make them aware of that. And once people are aware of that, then it's our job to sit down and what would we like to see? What kind of world would we like to be in? And that is a phenomenal amount of work. And I think sometimes we're so tied up with just what I call surviving. So we end up with survival fatigue. Just getting food every week is like a chore enough. The idea of visioning and actually then starting to scaffold that visioning and then starting to implement the visioning just seems like something that someone else is going to do. When actually the truth of the matter is, what I learned from my ancestors through the history of enslavement is actually, it's you. You've got to start it. There's no one else to do it. It's you.
It's really good point. I think also the need to inspire people actually to believe in that a different society is possible. I think that's what the left really has a lot of work to do. Okay, Richard, please.
Hi, Toyin. Thanks for that. I don't know where to begin, but I'll try and limit myself. I noticed, it's all white men coming on to ask questions, so I should try and limit my privilege a bit. I take your point about language and how important it is, but also the problems around using the concept of abolition. I mean, I have a similar issue around decolonizing, because colonizing is an act of violence. So I also don't want a reverse act of violence. But anyway, putting that aside, I'm a criminologist and I'm an abolitionist in as far as I want to see the back of prisons, I want to see the back of police, I want to see the back of well, at least a complete change in court system, and for at least two reasons. One is is the point that you just ended on, or that was just referred to at the end there, which is that we need to fire up our imaginations, yeah, to envisage something different. Yeah, the monarchy, really, we're still ruled by a single family from the 15th century. I mean, and borders, borders were created relatively recently, so we can envisage a borderless world. But in terms of criminal justice, and specifically the police, the other point, I think, is, and we know this, but it needs to be reminded again and again, how much the police cost. I did an audit of policing. I was part of a team that did an audit of policing in Milton Keynes, and just it's so expensive and so inefficient, even by its own terms. So regardless of what we think the police actually do, they don't even do that very well, and it's very slow and very costly. Yeah? And the equivalent with prisons, everyone knows it costs £35,000 minimum to keep someone in prison for a year, and going up to 80,000 if it's a young offender and things like that. So are we really saying that we can't think of a better way of spending that kind of money? Similarly with probation, even if we just gave the cost of probation to someone leaving prison, it would be a better use of it. So, so for those two reasons, we need radical change. We need to fire up our imaginations and our will for change. And we need to recognise that all of these things, war against drugs, that none of them are working in their own terms. So
no,
I'll leave it. I just realised it wasn't really a question, but.
No, it's fine. I think you make an amazing point. I think the only thing, I don't disagree with anything you say, especially on language. I mean, I'm a bit of a stickler for that. But I think the one argument I will say, and I think we sometimes forget, is that when we try to answer this question using rational logics, we're always doomed to fail, because the status quo that we're in is not a rational process. It's not the thoughts that got us here are irrational. They're couched in the language of rationality, but they are logical if you think about them as a process of fear, rationality, greed, envy, all these things mixed up with insecurities that starts all the way back from Enlightenment eras of trying to find a place in the world, trying to gather land and conquer as much as you can, and kind of like gather resources because you're scared of extinction, being frightened of the other, which we still live with now. All those things are irrational processes. And like I said, I come from an anthropological background, and one of the nightmares that anthropology gifted the world was structural functionalism. And it's this whole idea that everything could be conceptualized as this organic entity where this function did that, that part did that, and we had institutions that reaffirmed this, and the world was ordered in this lovely way, which is completely oppressive, which is designed to suppress dissent. It's designed to suppress innovation, anything that rocks that order, and it's an irrational process. It's the reason why I'm a scholar activist, because there's one half of my brain that's completely nerdy, that watches my Star Trek and my sci-fi and reads my books, and I want data and I want evidence. And there's the other side of me that says, actually, I feel that's really bad, and if you do that again, I'm going to actually just stop you. I don't really care what the consequences are. And what happens is that the world is actually run more on that energy. Conservatives, it's one of the challenges I often say between conservatism and liberalism, and this is a really strange one. When you are liberal thinking, I use the term loosely, I don't really like using these labels. What happens is that you tend to consider the consequences of your actions. So if you want to do something, you think about, is it going to cause harm? What are the benefits? Is it economical? We start to consider all these issues. And that actually is quite a lengthy process. It can be a lengthy process, and it's a right process. It's a moral process. If you're only engaged in conservatism, and this is a really crass caricature, but it gives you a good idea, then what we tend to do is think, or not we, because I'm not conservative, what tends to happen is that you don't really focus about the harms that you're causing. You just focus on getting the job done. And the downside of that is that it makes you ruthlessly efficient. It means that you get the job done. In a long term, it's just a disaster. But in a short term, it's like the get Brexit done nonsense. It's like, you know, we had to secure the PPE for the COVID. So who cares whether we kind of like, you know, spent X amount of the public funds? We got the job done. And we are wired to kind of like, you know, believe that actually that emotional language is right. It's the right thing to do. And this is what, for me, this is what causes the problem. We keep trying to rationalize irrational issues with logical arguments. And I think you cannot justify the police on a financial basis. You can't, there's no way to justify the prison system economically. It just doesn't work. We know it doesn't work. And we spend a ridiculous amount of energy doing cost-benefit analysis, trying to make arguments on these rational basis, when actually it will never work. And so the point is that sometimes we have to say to ourselves, well, okay, the system is wrong. We're looking at this not just from a captor's point of view, which is really where we're getting the hiding from, but we're looking at it from a lived experience point of view. And from our lived experience, and it's no longer anecdotal, because it's just like, you know, centuries worth of evidence that backs this. What have we learned? What should we do differently? And so, yeah, I mean, I know, like I said, it's a strange out theory, and I don't want to stray away too much, but it talks to the heart of the problem of what we're doing. And it's reason why I talk about art. Art, you know, is this kind of like, it's got no intrinsic value. If you look at it in a commercial sense, I mean, apart from the way we commodify everything, this pen, is it worth £5, or if I told you it was worth £500? How do we know that? But it has a function, and we can use art. And I think we've missed a trick with that. I think, you know, one of the things that happened in 67 and 68 when the student protest was around and young people were around, and even with the Black Panther movement, with their newspapers and the arts and the graphics and the berets, all these things created a cultural movement. And that cultural movement was emotional as much as it was intellectual. And when you fuse the cultural movement with intellectual concerns, that's when you have success. But what's happening, something's happened to the left that in striking to be so, I think it started, well, apologies if I upset anyone, but it started with that Blairite era. In striking to be so, God, I'm going to sound straight, I'm an academic, I'm going to say, it's trying to be so intellectual. And I'm not saying intellectualism is a bad thing. I would never say that, but it's striking to be so rational in that intellectual process and move into the centrist position, we lost the sight of the imagination. And the right has got its pulse on it, even though they're messing up right now. They're bold, they talk a whole load of nonsense, but at least there's energy there. And I think we have to, it's the reason why, you know, I was a supporter of Corbyn. He had that energy, he had that cultural vision. It was amazing. And he had the consistency in the track record. Anyway, I'll start really getting, if I go down the...
These are really important points. You're absolutely, I think you're spot on. Without capturing culture, we're never going to capture the majority of the working class to fight for a different system. I think that's really important.
This is what Gramsci talks about, the war position. Yeah. I mean, he's spot on it. The only thing I don't agree with Gramsci is the vanguard theory. It's the only thing I'm not a fan of the vanguard theory. It's a talented tenth theory.
You should present Gramsci in another session. What do you think?
No, I'm a fan, but I would have to critique just that one little bit there. And I just see someone talk about the wonderful Graeber. He was amazing. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Next we have Zbigniew. Oh, I've muted you. There we go.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd like to mention the countervailing forces within the police. I mean, I've worked with the police as a community development worker for 30 or 35 years, actually. But working with community development groups that stand up and fight for their communities. And I mean, the most recent examples would be that here in Nottingham, we piloted the misogyny becoming a hate crime. And that was definitely taken up through our police crime commissioner, because actually we'd campaigned here with the police and some people who actually took on Cressida Dick as well. When she was, you probably saw a past deputy chief constable when Cressida Dick was sacked by Mayor of London. and on Newsnight. So there are countervailing forces. There are the Police Federation, the black communities who came out at that time against the appalling killings by that policeman of Sarah Kennard. So I think in Sarah's law, etc., needs to be what was also started off here in Nottingham. So, and that was on the domestic violence right. So a lot of progress has been made within the police, with women becoming stronger within the police. And I think those are the things that you can build on. So I'd like you to add that to your plan and agenda, Toyin. Okay, cheers.
Thank you, Stephen. And it's a good point. And you're right. I mean, I know firsthand of the work of the Metropolitan Black Police Association, for example, and I know that there are many people who are doing community building work, which is why I don't always like to give the caveats. It's obviously clearly not all the police officers, but the best work tends to happen. I'm going to give you a couple of examples when it's from people who are actually in the community who are affected by the police. So here's a zine by the young people of Hackney, Hackney account, and they actually scrutinize the police externally. And the police are uncomfortable with their work, but it's amazing to have young people who have got other things to be doing, working on stop and search figures and abuse of force. They should be enjoying their life as young people, but this is what they're doing. One of the most amazing pieces of work that I've ever seen done from the community was this book, which deals with the Colin Roach murder in Stoke Newington. There was no inquiry, it was buried, the information. So the community commissioned their own inquiry. They just did it. And and so we're still not seeing justice, but we have the evidence. We can pass this on until justice is secured. And so it's that partnership working that I agree with. But I can't reiterate enough, the corruption in the police goes from the top down. And even though there are these amazing pockets of people inside who are doing great work, first of all, they shouldn't be having to do this work. If I read to you some of the quotes from this book, White Law, which was being published, I think, 1970, it's quite a long time ago. Much of what's inside here is still relevant to this very day today. It's scary. And so abolishing the police, I think, is, like I said, it's piece by piece dismantling that overreach. It's actually delegitimizing that authority to have police officers in schools. They should not be in schools. It's increasing the understanding that these so-called powers, like, they're not just stop and search. They're also like Section 60. They're like Section 44. All those kind of so-called powers, which are sometimes enacted without the public knowing, that can't happen anymore. There has to be complete transparency. And those are all transitional pieces of work that happens to we get to a state where society can actually police itself. And I saw something. I haven't had a chance to read the chat right now. I'm really sorry, and I will try and go through some. I've seen this comment about vigilantism, and there is a threat of that. There is a danger of that without a police force. But that's when you're assuming that there's a jump from a completely militarized police force to suddenly no police. That's not really what I'm an advocate for. I'm not an incrementalist. I've never been that. I don't believe in that, but I am a realist. And I do believe it is a gradual process. It's what's already happening in some states in America. You're taking away some of the resources, you're taking away some of the functions and returning them back to the people. And when that happens, then things like vigilantism stops happening. I mean, or it decreases, I should say. I'm not a fan of mob rules justice. Like I said, I support the idea of listening to countercultural voices, even those that disagree with me. In the UK, I am one of those countercultural voices. I am one of those minority communities. And so I would not want anything to happen to anyone else what I don't want happening to me. But we have to be sophisticated in the approach. And as activists, we sometimes can do hyperbole. Yeah, we can sometimes everything all or nothing. And that's not how things work. Then I'd be lying, and I don't lie.
Thank you, Toyin. I was just going to say something quickly because you might not have seen it in the chat. There's a bit of a jokey thing going on about grannies, and they should be called upon to, they've got time and they should help with the policing. And this is exactly actually what Camilla was talking about, Camilla Power, in when she was talking about at a time when women were more in charge in an egalitarian society, how grandmothers actually were crucial in keeping society going. And when a young bloke was trying to show off or whatever, get more food for himself, it tends to be the grannies who have experience and who have got the moral authority, who come down on him like a ton of bricks and start imitating him and trying to take the mickey out of him, basically, until he's been put back in his place. So all power to the grannies, definitely. Matthew, please.
Hi, comrades. It's very interesting. Just as you were saying, I was actually on the demonstration after Colin Roach was killed in East London. And you go back to all that stuff. The thing is, you look at there's various bits, and I think first of all, just as a sort of aside, you can see the motivation of John Brown actually in that he was in favour of free labour against slavery, because he was in Kansas. There was a big battle between those who were in favour of free labour and of course the use of slave labour against free labourers. And that was fought out with guns and so on in around the formation of that state itself. And that was his motivation, obviously, for being against slavery in general. As you say, a very great and brave act that he carried out. In terms of the cops, it's a central piece of capitalism, isn't it? The actual system itself, it requires this, as Lenin and Engels in particular said, the special bodies of armed men, and you can see the sort of privilege they're allowed. Like the cops essentially allowed to kill people without any, with impunity. Obviously certain exceptions, but certainly, whenever the state requires it, then essentially they're allowed to kill people. And in the US, obviously, they're effectively encouraged to kill whoever they want, essentially providing they're of the right class. If they were around killing people with money, obviously they're being shipped. But killing working class people is you can gun them down with no issue, or beat them to death, or lock them up, or whatever else. And it's also, I think it's because the system itself is in a state of degeneration. It's actually falling apart. So it throws in these ridiculous things. I think there's a film issued just recently on the Attica Revolt, in New York, which I want to try and see, because I think it's obviously arising out of this extraordinary movement around after the killing of George Jackson. That at that point, of course, in the US, there were only 300,000 people in prison. And this was seen as being far too many. And now there are 6 million people in the prison system. It's extraordinary. It's just gone completely crazy. The system itself, and it's a means of basically of intimidating the population, in general. And they don't look at it in terms of a cost. They just want, they want the effect, really, to get the population organising itself, or questioning anything, or indeed, demanding that it should be given, as has happened in the States, of course, where you've now got a huge element of the population which doesn't have adequate housing, or it can't rely on food supply, any of this sort of stuff, and in some cases is forced to work ridiculous hours, and it's that as a means of doing it. But I think that if you look at the thing, then becomes political, isn't it? And I think there's sort of an issue in terms of how do you politically organise against that? And obviously at the moment, what they're allied to that, obviously the ruling class itself is attempting to encourage the far right. That's why the far right has all this energy, is because the ruling class is deliberately feeding it and wants it in case it needs it. And clearly it's getting to the point, as we see in the US in 20 last year on the 6th January that there's a possibility of an actual coup by the right. You know, they did try it. You know, they're prepared to use these forces. The thing is, I mean, you know, if you get down to the likes of the issue in terms of the politics of the Panthers, the problem with the Panthers, of course, is they were Maoists and they believed this notion that power flows from the barrel of the gun. You know, and there were points, and it's a very interesting point that was made in a book on the, you know, which is a huge thing called Set the Night on Fire, in terms of the movements in LA, including the Panthers. Which they point out in this book that, of course, the problem was for the Panthers that, you know, they had this issue that either at some point there was a fork in the road. They could actually either become a mass political movement, or they could be a military challenge to the cops, and they couldn't do both. And they decided the military side, and they decided to wind on this situation where they wound up with these sort of mass, you know, all-day gunfights with the cops. Which is all you know, magnificent and heroic and all the rest of it, but didn't actually move, you know, things forward politically. And they said that they could have actually organised a mass movement because they could, you know, all they had to do was appeal. They had, you know, they had the facility to do it, and they would have easily organised, you know, hundreds of thousands of people without particular issue. And this is also, of course, then the question for what comes out of the Black Lives Matter movement. Because I mean, Black Lives Matter movement in the US was the biggest set of demonstrations probably in US history. It was enormous. It lasted for months, most of a year. My daughter spent like months and months talking to people in Portland, you know, who were fighting on the street all night, every night, virtually, you know, for weeks. You know, it's a crazy time, you know. But what politically comes out of it, you know, at the moment, unfortunately, very little. You know, this is the problem we've got. You know, all these people on the street and raising, you know, the right questions, many of the right questions. But the thing is that they've managed to obscure that, and they've managed to prevent anything politically coming out of it that went beyond the existing political organisations, particularly the Democratic Party. And in that sense, it's been very successful for them, and a very bad thing for us, in that we haven't actually managed to generate something political, you know, a real political movement out of that great near uprising against the fact that, obviously, as I say, the cops are essentially given license to kill people, you know. And they, you know, they do. I think they documented that in the US they kill something like 1,300 people a year, you know. And probably twice that in reality, you know, and lock up 6 million people, you know, which is it's a bizarre system. So the question really is, okay, you know, how do we get beyond this, and how do we actually do it? It has to be on the basis of an understanding of, you know, that this is part of capital and its actual disintegration. The fact that they're trying to hold together a system which is actually falling apart around them, you know, I think that's critical to the point. Thanks, Colin.
Thanks, Matthew. I mean, there's a lot of food for thought there. I mean, there are a few things I'm not sure I have the time to kind of like expand a little bit upon, especially the rendition of the Panther history. It's not quite as you saw, and there was far much more issues going on with the US organization. Rival gangsters. There's reasons why the Panther movement took the trajectory it took. It's not quite as simple. I haven't read the works that you've mentioned, but that would be probably another discussion for another day. But I mean, where did I start? Okay, so where did you start? You started off with this rendition of the police really being able to just kind of like force compliance on the public, and I think you're right on that. I mean, that's part of its job, isn't it? I mean, it came from, in the UK at least, it came from, it was echoed on what was taking place in Ireland, and so it was always seen as that, regardless of what they talk about John Peel and kind of the Bow Street Runners. I think that, God, you just said so much, and it's the nerd in me who wants to hit every single point, and I'm trying to avoid doing that. I think you kind of narrow down some of the achievements of some of those movements over time. I think even if I was just to go to the Black Lives Matter movement, And you're right, the groundswell of action that took place, I think you sometimes forget that it had an international dimension for one. And that even though it did embolden the Democratic Party to actually just about secure an electoral win, and that's also been pretty much squandered, it did do that most remarkable thing, which is one thing that we should never, ever underestimate. It reminded police officers for the first time that they could be prosecuted for murdering African Americans. And that is actually quite substantial. I'm not saying it's the end of the road. I'm not saying there's not more to do, but it is really important that we kind of like start saying that change can happen. I could talk about how it's impacted in the UK and impacted in other parts of the states of the world, but that's another issue. I also want to just mention as well is that this distinction between the far right and the political elite is actually an artificial distinction. I would suggest quite strongly that actually the government we have now is a far right party. It is an amalgamation of UKIP, the EDL. That's what it is. And so the language of far right is very good for creating this strawman argument, this boogeyman. And so someone who's far right is a skinhead with a swastika tattooed into their head and they use the N-word. But it's actually more sophisticated. It's grown up. The movement has actually become established. It's just become more sophisticated and more in your face. And so, you know, in a sense, more powerful. So, I think that what we have to do, and I'm guilty of as well, I'm from a certain generation and we kind of like see certain ways and we get locked into those ways. But, my three children, same way you're fed through your children, I'm fed through my children, what's happening on the ground. They have a different energy. They see things different. They aspire to a different kind of future. They see different kind of solutions. I might not agree with them all, but what I do recognize is that the picture of the world that I conceptualize of how policing could be and what it should be is different from what they see should be and could be. And so I think we have to be mindful that we never ever think that these and they are movements which start, as far as from my experience, from as way back as in the enslavement period, where people were told for hundreds and hundreds of years, centuries, that you will never be free, are worthless, that they do not lead to tangible outcomes. I'm only here because of some Africans in Haiti who said, actually, we're going to free the whole island. And we don't care if we're going to take on the British, the Spanish, and the French armies, who were the superpowers at the time. We're going to defeat them. And we have this concept of human rights because of that. And so I'm just saying, sometimes we have to think in the long term, as opposed to kind of like where we are right now. And we are socialized to do that, to see things in little chunks and then have adverts in between and another chunk and adverts. We watch films on domestic cable. You know, we're told to suspend belief, spend millions on films, and there's an advert that says, oh, buy this, buy that, buy that, buy that. We come into this commercial world and we go back into the film again. Sometimes we can't see where we are. It's all normalized, and that's part of the problem. But I'm not poo-pooing what you said. You're right. The function of the police right now, as it is as stated. Sorry, I'm doing my nerdy thing again.
Thank you, Toyin. The last speaker from the floor is Christine. I would have brought you in earlier, but you put your hand up really late. Hi, Christine.
I wasn't going to put my hand up, but I'm here to represent my demographic, really. I'm the one who started the talk about the vigilante grannies, and I am a bit serious about that. I mean, I've actually made several policemen feel really guilty when they've tried to stop me doing something, and they can't because I'm a disabled pensioner and a very tiny woman, you know, and they know if they get hold of me, they'll look really stupid. So, but what is the place of the guilt-making grannies on a kind of microscopic street level? You know, we probably have quite a good role to play in disciplining young people or just making them feel guilty, and in making the police feel guilty as well, because you know, someone needs to, because they're doing terrible things sometimes, and I've managed to stop them stopping me doing it occasionally. Thank you.
Well, the first thing I want to say is thank you. And I mean that right from the bottom of my heart. That is exactly what a decent human being should be doing. And I think you have to rely on the fact that we live in a society that throws women and those who are regarded as elderly on the rubbish pile. They assume that we are worthless, that we're helpless, that we are weak. And I think that actually, rather than wasting energy in trying to prove that we're not, just abuse that as a weakness and do exactly what you do. I think that there's much to be said about interventions using kind of like this idea of toxic masculinity. So, a policeman who's fresh out of Hendon can't get any brownie points from rough handling a granny. It just looks wrong. And so if you know that, abuse it. If there's one good part of the Extinction Rebellion tactics that I do agree with, it's the fact that they recognize, and I remember hearing it from the mouth of a police officer, he was reluctant to arrest someone who looked like his granny. And so even though they were tying themselves up and they were disrupting and causing major disruptions, it was that familiarity, it was that those ideas of masculinity which asserts this, oh, I'm a man, I must come in and be a man. Well, actually, you've got the advantage of emotional intelligence, you've got lived experience, and you've just got decent ethics, and just utilize them. And then more importantly, so it's like I would say for someone like yourself and anyone else who identifies, is actually share that wisdom. Just sometimes cook a meal, bring the family around, and then tell them what you did and tell them what you'd like them to do, and just plant that seed in their head so that they recognize that actually that this is a lifelong process. One of the things, my PhD research was on activism, and one of the things I came out of my research was this whole idea that we moved into this phase of what I call faddism. So people engage in activist projects for really maximum around 3 to 6 months, and then they get bored and moved on. It's like what I call what do you call it? Those dishes where you kind of sample bits of food, the buffet style of activism. So you're interested in one cause, and you kind of like, oh, okay, I'm dealing with that. I'm a feminist today. Oh, I'm bored now. I'm going to deal with environmental issues, and they move around the plate, and it goes around in a circle, and they come back to, oh, I want to deal with anti-racism today, and that's it. Well, the actual term activism was coined like in the 15th century. Rudolf Jochen is a German philosopher. And actually, when it was first coined, it defined a lifelong process. So if you as an activist, if you dare to even identify with activism, then you recognize actually that you were involved in a process to have a life that was meaningful. And to do anything else was actually just wasting your life. And it changes the way that people, if they conceptualize activism in this way, can actually work. It means that you can be intense for a year doing all this sort of stuff, and then you just get fatigued, or you get depressed, and you get bored, or you kind of like got to move on, you got to do something else, but you're going to return to it. So you don't have the guilt or the angst, because you know it's a lifelong process. And we don't think of things like that. And I think we need to go back to that if we have values that define us, and we're growing as humans all the time, then we have to recognize that we don't have to be visible about our activism. Sometimes the work happens around a dining table. I remember when that orange man in the White House was causing all this mischief, trouble. And I have colleagues, and inside their families, there were many who had American compatriots, members. There were many Trump supporters. And I'm saying, and they felt ashamed of it. And I said, well, don't just be ashamed. That's useless. You know what I mean? Kind of talk with them. Don't try to convince them. Just have a discussion with them. Be rational. And then start influencing a different vision for them. It might work, it might not. But, it's not hopeless. And I think we all have a role to play. And so, I love this thing about active grannies. And just weaponize it. The state loves to weaponize kind of like, feral youth and kind of like, animalistic blacks and kind of like, I don't normally use these kind of terms, but they're constantly doing this, like, disabled codgers and all that kind of stuff. If they are played and with those stereotypes, those are actually crutches, they're weaknesses. Exploit them, just exploit them continuously, and then be strategic with it. So thank you for the work that you're doing.
I think that was a really good summing up. I think we've got a way forward now. We're building the granny army as an alternative to the police, etc. I just think it's fascinating. I think you and Camilla's openings were by far the most inspiring, and looking at the past to think of a vision for the future is, I think, hugely important, and the need to inspire ourselves through dancing, culture, etc., to think of a different society that is not based on exploitation and a hierarchy, but we could live in a totally different way together. Is, I think, it really sums up what we were trying to achieve with this series Abolition, is to open people's minds and to rethink things. They haven't been always like this. And so we can actually change society for the better if we put our mind to it and think it through. Thank you very much for coming along. That was a very, very interesting and entertaining session, and it will be online fairly soon. I hope you join us next week, when I think we'll be talking about abolishing money, if I'm not totally wrong, which should be an interesting one as well, because that's not been around for very long either. No. So thank you very much, Toyin. Thank you, comrades, for being so involved and asking good questions, and have a good evening.
Thank you. Have a good evening too.